The barking was intense, distressing. Elliot knew something was wrong. He didn't own any dogs, and the sound wasn't coming from his property. Winter Hollow was blanketed in a relentless snowstorm, the kind that silenced the world, making the barking even more jarring. With a flashlight in hand and a thick coat wrapped around him, Elliot stepped into the icy night, the wind biting his face. His breath escaped in visible puffs as he trudged toward the source of the sound, a dilapidated house that had been abandoned for years, standing stark against the white expanse. Elliot paused at the edge of the property, squinting against the swirling snow. The barking grew louder, more desperate. He felt his pulse quicken, his mind racing. What could be inside? A stray dog, wild animals. He wasn't one to involve himself in other people's problems, but something about the sheer urgency in the barking pulled him forward. The wooden steps creaked ominously as he ascended to the door. It was ajar, swinging slightly in the wind. "Hello?" His voice was swallowed by the storm, pushing the door open. The hinges groaned in protest, revealing an interior cloaked in shadows. The flashlight beam darted across broken furniture. It cracked walls and piles of debris. Then, in a far corner, his light landed on the source of the barking. A German shepherd stood, its body rigid, fur bristling and eyes glowing with a mix of fear and warning. It barked again, a low guttural sound, its stance protective. But it wasn't the dog that made Elliot freeze. Curled beneath the animal, barely visible under a tattered blanket, were two tiny figures, babies. Their faint cries intertwined with the dog's growls, creating a symphony of desperation. Elliot's heart stuttered. He took a cautious step forward. But the dog, Ben, as he would later learn, lowered its head. Baring its teeth in a clear warning, the dog's powerful frame shielded the infants, its eyes never leaving Elliot's. "Easy now," Elliot murmured, lowering himself to the floor to appear less threatening. He extended a hand cautiously, the flashlight casting a soft glow on the pitiful scene. "I'm not here to hurt you," the dog growled but didn't attack. It was clear that Ben's aggression stemmed not from malice, but from pure, unyielding loyalty to the helpless babies under his care. Elliot's eyes shifted to the infants. Their faces were pale, their breaths shallow, and their tiny hands peeked out from the inadequate blanket. The cold hit Elliot like a slap. The house was freezing, the broken windows allowing snow to drift inside. He realized with a sinking feeling that these children wouldn't survive much longer in these conditions. But how had they gotten here? Who would leave them? "I need to get you out of here," Elliot whispered, his voice cracking. He wasn't sure if he was talking to the babies, the dog, or himself. He moved slowly, reaching into his coat pocket for a scarf. He extended it toward Ben, a peace offering of sorts. Ben sniffed the fabric but didn't move, his eyes watching Elliot with a mix of distrust and hope, summoning his courage. Elliot stood. He wasn't a man accustomed to physical exertion, but his wealth couldn't buy the strength he needed now. He searched the room for anything that could serve as insulation. Grabbing an old curtain, he fashioned a makeshift bundle, wrapping the infants as gently as he could. Ben watched every move, his growls turning into soft whines, as if understanding Elliot's intentions. When Elliot finally scooped up the babies, their frail bodies felt impossibly light in his arms. Ben barked sharply, following so closely that his wet nose brushed against Elliot's leg. "All right, you're coming too," Elliot said. His voice steadier than he felt. He had no choice. The dog wouldn't let him leave otherwise. The journey back to Elliot's mansion was harrowing. The storm raged, snowflakes whipping against his face. His boots sank into the drifts, every step a battle. Ben stayed by his side, his body pressed against Elliot's as if lending him strength. The babies stirred faintly, their soft cries barely audible over the howling wind. When Elliot finally reached the warmth of his grand foyer, he almost collapsed from relief. The heat enveloped him, and he wasted no time placing the babies on a thick rug near the fireplace. He unwrapped them carefully, his hands trembling as he checked their tiny faces. They were cold but alive. Ben padded closer, his eyes fixed on the babies. His earlier aggression was gone, replaced by an almost human concern. He lay beside them, curling his body around the children as if he were still their guardian. Elliot sank into a nearby chair, his heart pounding. The scene before him was surreal. A millionaire who had spent his life avoiding entanglements, now faced with 2 abandoned babies and a dog who seemed to embody pure devotion. Questions swirled in his mind. Who were these children? Where were their parents? And what kind of person would leave them in such a state? The crackling of the fire provided a comforting rhythm, but Elliot felt anything but calm. His life had been one of solitude and calculated decisions, yet in the span of an hour, everything had changed. He glanced at Ben, whose steady gaze met his. There was something in the dog's eyes, a silent plea, a challenge. "I guess we're in this together," Elliot muttered, his voice low but resolute. As the storm raged outside, Elliot knew that this was only the beginning. The real battle would be what came next. The morning after the storm, Elliot woke to the soft whimpers of the babies and the sharp, watchful gaze of Ben. The grand living room, usually a place of silence and order, now buzzed with life. The fireplace crackled warmly, but it did little to ease Elliot's growing unease. The infants, wrapped in the thick blankets he had provided, stirred restlessly. Their pale faces and shallow breathing reminded him of how fragile their situation was. Ben lay close to them, his ears twitching at every sound, his body forming a barrier between the babies and the rest of the world. Elliot approached cautiously with a bowl of warm water and a clean cloth. "We need to clean you up," he murmured, his voice softer than he expected. Ben's gaze followed his every move, his eyes narrowing slightly as Elliot knelt beside the children. Elliot hesitated. His hands, accustomed to signing contracts and holding fine cigars, now trembled as he reached for the nearest infant. The baby let out a faint cry, its tiny fingers curling instinctively around his thumb. The touch sent a jolt through him, a mix of fear and an unexpected warmth. Ben growled softly, more of a warning than a threat. "I'm not going to hurt them," Elliot said, his voice firmer now. The dog's ears perked, but he didn't move, his protective stance unyielding, realizing he needed help. Elliot picked up the phone and dialed Clara, a retired nurse who lived nearby. Clara had been a steady presence in Winter Hollow for decades, known for her practicality and unwavering kindness. When Elliot explained the situation, her initial disbelief quickly gave way to action. "I'll be there in 10 minutes, she said, her tone brisk, true to her word. Clara arrived bundled in layers against the cold, her medical bag in hand. Her sharp eyes took in the scene with a mix of astonishment and concern. "Elliot, what on earth have you gotten yourself into?" she asked, kneeling beside the babies without waiting for an answer. "It's not like I planned this," he replied, gesturing helplessly at the infants. "I found them last night, and the dog, Ben, he won't let me near them without growling." Clara glanced at Ben, who now regarded her with the same wary intensity he had given Elliot. "He's protecting them," she said simply. "Smart dog, but we need to work together if we're going to help these little ones." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small bottle of formula. "Let's start with feeding them. They're dehydrated and malnourished." Elliot watched as Clara mixed the formula with practiced ease. Her hands moved with confidence, a stark contrast to his fumbling attempts earlier. She offered the bottle to the first baby, who latched on weakly but drank. Ben's growls softened as he watched Clara work, as if sensing her intentions. As the hours passed, the mansion transformed into an impromptu nursery. Clara instructed Elliot on how to hold the babies, how to swaddle them properly, and how to soothe their cries. Each task felt monumental, but Elliot found himself absorbing her guidance with unexpected determination. "Why are you doing this?" Clara asked during a rare moment of quiet. Elliot hesitated, unsure of the answer himself. "I couldn't leave them there," he said finally. And the dog? It's like he wouldn't let me, even if I wanted to. Clara nodded, her expression softening. Sometimes life throws us into situations we're not prepared for. It's what we do next that matters. As night fell, the challenges multiplied. One of the babies developed a slight fever, prompting Clara to stay the night. Ben became restless, pacing the room and whining softly, as if sensing the child's discomfort. Elliot found himself cradling the feverish infant. His once confident demeanor replaced by an unfamiliar vulnerability. "Breathe, Elliot," Clara said gently as she prepared a cool compress. "Babies pick up on your emotions. Stay calm for their sake." Elliot nodded, his jaw tightening as he followed her instructions. He felt Ben's presence beside him. The dog's steady gaze a silent reassurance. By the third day, the fever had subsided, but exhaustion weighed heavily on everyone. Elliot sat slumped in an armchair, his shirt wrinkled and his hair disheveled. Clara dozed lightly on the sofa, her medical bag within reach. The babies slept peacefully in their makeshift cribs. And Ben lay curled at their feet, his eyes half closed but still alert. Elliot studied the scene before him, his mind racing. He had spent years building walls, emotional and physical, around his life. Yet here he was, surrounded by chaos and responsibility he never asked for, feeling more alive than he had in decades. When Clara stirred and opened her eyes, she found Elliot staring at her. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. "We take it one day at a time," she replied. "And you'll have to earn that dog's trust. He's not going to let you off easy." Elliot glanced at Ben, whose ears twitched at the mention of his name. "I'll figure it out," he said, more to himself than anyone else. The morning sun streamed through the frosted windows, casting soft golden light across the living room. Elliot sat on the edge of his armchair, his eyes fixed on Ben, who stood at the foot of the makeshift cribs. The dog's unwavering gaze alternated between the sleeping babies and the door. His body tense, as though he were anticipating a threat. There was something extraordinary about Ben. His actions weren't just instinctual. They carried an air of purpose, as if he understood the gravity of the situation. Elliot had always believed in practicality, yet Ben challenged that notion. How could a dog display such devotion? Was it mere training, or was there something deeper at play? Elliot leaned back, his thoughts interrupted by Clara entering the room, holding a small, weathered bag. "I found this tucked under the blankets they were wrapped in," Clara said, her voice tinged with curiosity. She set the bag on the coffee table and carefully opened it. Inside was a folded piece of paper, yellowed at the edges and slightly damp from the cold. "It's a letter," she murmured, smoothing it out. Elliot moved closer, the tension in the room palpable. Clara began to read aloud, her voice steady but emotional. "To whoever finds this, I write with a heart full of sorrow, but also hope. These are my children, Anna and James. I cannot provide for them, but I refuse to let them die with me. I entrust their lives to Ben, who has been more than just a protector. He is their guardian. Please, if you find them, give them a chance at life. Ben will guide you. Trust him as I have. May God forgive me." The room fell silent. Elliot's chest tightened, his mind racing with the weight of the mother's words. He glanced at the babies, their tiny forms so vulnerable, and then at Ben, who met his gaze with a quiet resolve. "She knew she wouldn't make it," Clara said softly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "But she believed in Ben enough to leave everything in his care. That kind of trust is rare." Elliot swallowed hard, the letter stirring something deep within him. He had always prided himself on self-reliance, but here was a mother who had placed her faith entirely in a dog, and Ben had not only lived up to that trust, but exceeded it. "What kind of dog does that?" Elliot asked, his voice almost a whisper. "A trained one," Clara replied, "but even training doesn't explain all of this. There's love here, Elliot. You can see it in how he watches them, how he stayed with them, despite everything." Elliot nodded, his gaze shifting to Ben, who had resumed his vigilant post by the cribs. The dog's eyes held a story, a past that Elliot couldn't quite piece together, but desperately wanted to understand. Later that day, as Clara prepared a light lunch, Elliot decided to test a theory. He found an old tennis ball in the corner of his study and held it up. "Let's see what you've got." "Ben!" The dog's ears perked up, his posture immediately shifting to one of alert readiness. Elliot tossed the ball gently across the room, and Ben sprinted after it with precision, snatching it midair. But what surprised Elliot wasn't the retrieval. It was the way Ben returned, dropping the ball at his feet and sitting, his posture rigid and attentive. "You were trained for something," Elliot murmured. "But what?" The answer came later that evening. Clara, ever resourceful, found a faded leather collar tucked inside the bag. Attached was a small tag etched with the words, "Service animal." "Service animal," Elliot echoed, running his fingers over the worn leather. "It explains his behavior," Clara said. "He wasn't just any dog. He was trained to protect, to assist, and clearly his bond with that family went beyond duty." Elliot studied Ben, who seemed to sense their conversation and moved closer, his eyes locking with Elliot's. For a moment, Elliot felt as though the dog was trying to communicate, to share a part of his story that words couldn't express. As the days passed, Elliot couldn't shake the weight of the letter and what it represented. The mother's sacrifice mirrored his own failures, though in a much different light. She had given everything for her children, even if it meant entrusting them to a dog. Elliot, on the other hand, had spent years distancing himself from the people who once mattered most. One evening, after the babies had been fed and settled, Elliot found himself sitting by the fire, the letter in his hands. Ben lay at his feet, his head resting on his paws. "You've done more for them in a week than I've done for anyone in years," Elliot said, his voice heavy with regret. "I don't know if I deserve to be part of this, but I'm trying." Ben's ears twitched, and he lifted his head, his gaze softening. It was a look of understanding, almost as if the dog was acknowledging Elliot's struggle. The next morning, Clara announced her departure to tend to other responsibilities, but promised to return soon. Before leaving, she placed a reassuring hand on Elliot's shoulder. "You're doing fine, and Ben, well, he's teaching you more than you realize." Alone with the babies and the dog, Elliot felt the weight of responsibility settle over him. But for the first time in years, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a second chance. The house was unusually quiet that night, save for the soft crackling of the fire in the living room. Snow continued to fall heavily outside, the wind howling against the windows. Elliot was in his study, leafing through old books in an attempt to distract himself from the persistent, gnawing feeling of inadequacy that had settled in his chest since taking in the babies. In the other room, Max lay curled beside the cribs, his body tense, as if standing guard against an invisible threat. Then it came, the sharp, urgent bark that echoed through the house like an alarm. Elliot's head snapped up, his heart immediately racing. He hadn't heard Max bark like that since the night he'd found them in the abandoned house. Dropping the book, he bolted out of the study and into the living room. Max was standing stiff, his tail low but wagging slightly as he barked again, his gaze fixed on the cribs. "What is it, boy?" Elliot asked, his voice edged with worry. As he moved closer, he noticed one of the babies, James, was unnaturally still. The child's face was flushed, and his small chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow breaths. Panic surged through Elliot. "Clara!" he shouted, running toward the guest room where she had been resting. She appeared moments later, already pulling on her sweater. One look at James and her expression turned grave. "He's burning up," she said, pressing a hand to the baby's forehead. "It's a high fever. We need to cool him down, fast." Clara sprang into action, instructing Elliot to bring damp cloths and prepare warm water, but it became clear within minutes that James's condition was deteriorating. His tiny cries turned weaker, his body limp in Clara's arms. "We have to get him to a clinic," Clara said, her tone firm but laced with worry. "He needs medication, and we don't have it here." Elliot's heart sank as he glanced out the window. The snowstorm outside was relentless, with thick drifts piling up against the door. "How are we supposed to get there in this?" "We have to try," Clara said. "If we wait, he might not make it." Elliot felt the weight of her words like a blow to his chest. He turned to Max, who stood by the door, tail wagging anxiously, as if urging them to move. Taking a deep breath, Elliot nodded. "We'll figure it out." Clara quickly bundled James in layers of blankets, leaving his face exposed to ensure he could breathe. Elliot ran to the garage and dragged out an old wooden sled he hadn't used in years. With Clara's help, they fastened the sled with straps and made a small, secure bed for James on top. Max jumped onto the sled without hesitation, curling protectively around the baby as if understanding his role. "Stay close to him," Elliot said softly, stroking the dog's fur. Max looked up at him, his eyes calm yet resolute. Clara bundled up the second baby, Anna, and secured her in a carrier strapped to Elliot's chest. "You'll have to hold her tight," she warned. "The cold will be brutal." The three of them stepped out into the storm. The wind hit like a wall, icy shards cutting into their exposed skin. Elliot struggled to pull the sled, each step a battle against the snow that reached his knees. Max remained steady, his body shielding James from the worst of the cold. As he lay curled tightly around the baby, Clara walked beside Elliot, her hand gripping the sled's edge to keep it steady. The journey to the clinic felt endless. The world outside was a blur of white, the snow erasing the familiar landmarks of Winter Hollow. Elliot's muscles burned with effort, but he refused to stop. Anna whimpered softly against his chest, her warmth a reminder of why he couldn't fail. "Just a little further," Clara said, though her voice trembled with uncertainty. Suddenly, Max barked sharply, snapping Elliot out of his fog of exhaustion. The dog leaped off the sled, running a few feet ahead before barking again. "He's found the trail," Clara shouted, relief breaking through her voice. Elliot followed Max's lead, his legs moving on pure adrenaline. The faint lights of the clinic appeared in the distance, a beacon of hope cutting through the storm. By the time they reached the clinic, Elliot could barely stand. He collapsed to his knees as the doors swung open and the staff rushed out to take James. Clara followed them inside, giving Elliot a quick nod of reassurance. Max stayed behind, his body trembling from the cold, but his eyes never leaving the sled where James had been. Elliot knelt beside him, wrapping his arms around the dog despite the chill. "You did it, Ben. You saved him." The warmth of the clinic enveloped them as they stepped inside. Elliot slumped into a chair, his body heavy with exhaustion, but his heart pounding with gratitude. Max lay at his feet, his eyes half closed, but his body still alert. Hours passed before Clara emerged from the treatment room. "He's stable," she said, her face softening into a tired smile. "The fever's down, and he's responding to the medication." Elliot let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He looked down at Max, who wagged his tail faintly as if understanding the good news. "We couldn't have done it without you," Elliot said, his voice thick with emotion as the storm raged on outside. Elliot found himself reflecting on the night's events. He had faced one of the most harrowing experiences of his life. Yet he hadn't done it alone. Max's unwavering loyalty and Clara's guidance had shown him the power of trust and teamwork. For the first time, he felt something he hadn't in years, a sense of purpose. The days after James's recovery were filled with a warmth Elliot hadn't experienced in years. The storm had passed, leaving Winter Hollow covered in a pristine blanket of snow. Yet, inside the mansion, life bustled with new energy. The grand halls, once silent and cold, now resonated with the soft coos of the babies and the gentle patter of Max's footsteps as he faithfully guarded his charges. Elliot stood in the nursery he had spent the last few days transforming. The walls were painted a soft yellow, a color Clara had suggested for its cheerful warmth. Cribs, toys, and a rocking chair now occupied the space that had once been a sterile guest room. Max lay in the corner on a plush dog bed, but his ears perked up every time Anna or James stirred in their sleep. Clara entered carrying a tray with tea and biscuits. She placed it on a nearby table and gave Elliot an approving nod. "You've done wonders with this place. I hardly recognize it." Elliot chuckled softly. "Neither do I. I'm not sure who's more surprised by all this, me or the staff. They've never seen this house so alive." Clara smiled, but her expression turned thoughtful. "What's next, Elliot? Have you thought about making things official?" He nodded, his gaze falling on the babies. "I've been thinking about it non-stop. They deserve stability, Clara, a real family, but it's not just about what they need. I want this. I didn't think I would, but I do." Clara's eyes softened. "Then let's make it happen. It won't be easy, but I'll help in any way I can." Elliot's first step was to consult a local attorney. Mrs. Harper, a seasoned professional with a reputation for her meticulous approach, agreed to meet him at the mansion. Her grey hair was tied neatly in a bun, and her sharp eyes scanned the documents Elliot had managed to retrieve from the abandoned house. "This letter is compelling," she said. Tapping the worn piece of paper from the children's mother, "It shows intent, but it's not enough for a legal adoption. We'll need to involve child welfare services and conduct a background check on you. Are you prepared for that?" Elliot nodded firmly. "I'll do whatever it takes." "Good, Mrs." Harper replied. "It's clear these children have bonded with you, and that will work in your favor. But there may be complications. If any biological family members come forward, the process could be delayed or even contested." The weight of her words settled over Elliot, but he refused to waver. "I'll deal with whatever comes. These babies deserve a home, and I'll make sure they have one." Over the next few weeks, Elliot immersed himself in the adoption process. Home visits from social workers became a regular occurrence, each one an opportunity for Elliot to prove his commitment. Clara often joined him, helping to navigate questions and demonstrating her unwavering support. Max's role in all of this did not go unnoticed. During one visit, the social worker observed how the dog interacted with the babies, noting his calm demeanor and protective instincts. "It's rare to see such a strong bond," she remarked. "Max seems to sense their needs," Elliot smiled, scratching Max behind the ears. "He's their guardian angel. I don't think I could do this without him." Despite the progress, challenges arose. One evening, Mrs. Harper called with unexpected news. "We've located a distant relative on the mother's side. They're hesitant to step forward, but have expressed interest in meeting the children." Elliot's chest tightened. "What does that mean for the adoption?" "It's too soon to tell," Mrs. Harper admitted. "They have the right to be considered, but it's ultimately up to the court to decide what's in the best interest of the children. You'll need to be prepared to make your case." The meeting with the relative, a middle-aged man named Thomas, was tense but civil. Thomas seemed unsure of himself, his demeanor wavering between guilt and uncertainty. He admitted he barely knew the children's mother and wasn't in a position to take on 2 infants. "I just wanted to make sure they're safe," he said quietly. "It sounds like you've given them a good home. I don't want to interfere with that." Elliot felt a surge of relief, but maintained his composure. "Thank you for coming forward. I can promise you they're loved and cared for here, and if you ever want to be part of their lives, that door is open." Thomas nodded, his expression softening. "Maybe someday. For now, they're where they belong." The final court hearing was scheduled for a crisp spring morning. Clara accompanied Elliot, Offering him a steadying presence as they waited for the judge's decision, Elliot glanced at the twins, who sat in their stroller, blissfully unaware of the gravity of the moment. Max, of course, was not far behind, lying at Elliot's feet with his ever-watchful gaze. When the judge finally delivered her verdict, Elliot's heart soared. Based on the evidence presented, I find that Mr. Elliot Green has demonstrated his ability and willingness to provide a loving and stable home for these children. The petition for adoption is granted. Tears blurred Elliot's vision as Clara squeezed his arm. "You did it," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Back at the mansion, a quiet celebration awaited. The staff had prepared a small gathering, complete with balloons and a cake that read, "Welcome home." Anna and James. Elliot stood by the fireplace, holding James in one arm while Anna clung to his leg. Max sat proudly beside them, his tail wagging as if he understood the moment's significance. Clara raised a glass of sparkling cider. To Elliot, Anna, James, and Max. A family brought together by fate and held together by love. Cheers! The room erupted in applause, and Elliot felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. He looked down at Max, who had played an instrumental role in bringing this family together. "Thank you, old friend," he murmured, scratching the dog's head. Max leaned into the touch, his eyes soft and content. For the first time in years, Elliot felt a profound sense of peace. His home was no longer just a mansion. It was a sanctuary filled with life, love, and hope for the future. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story. Help us grow and bring you more heartfelt tales.